Good afternoon, good morning, buenas tardes, buenos días. My name is Tommaso Ferrando and I'm a research professor at the Institute of Development Policy and at the Faculty of Law at the University of Antwerp in Belgium. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to today's webinars entitled Migrant Farmworkers, Resisting and Organizing Before, During and After COVID-19. We're more than 70 people at the moment and the numbers are going up, and we're extremely excited to see that our webinar had such a good impact. Before we move on, I would like to remind all the participants that we have simultaneous interpretation from English to Spanish, and that we're grateful to the interpreters Monica and David for their work and support. As you can see from the slide, in order to access the interpretation, you have to click on the button below that says interpretation and select Spanish. If you're using an Apple iPhone or an Android phone, you need to click on the three dots in meeting controls, tap language interpretation, and select Spanish. I also want to invite all of you to ask questions in the Q&A chat that you can access by clicking here below somewhere, depending on where you are seeing it. It is definitely our intention to have enough space to engage with as many of your questions as possible, and we will also pass all the unaddressed questions to the panelists. So let's get the ball rolling. Today's webinar was made possible by the collective effort of all the people that you will be hearing from, but I would like to thank in particular the four co-organizers. So the Institute of Development Policy at the University of Antwerp, the University of Bristol Law School, the Transnational Institute, and the Canada Caribbean Institute at Brock University and the University of the West Indies. Today's event brings together 5 farm workers, activists, and union organizers from different parts of the world who have been closely involved in the struggle of farm workers and migrant farm workers during the ongoing COVID pandemic and long before. COVID-19 has revealed both the violence and fragility of the global corporate food system. First of all, it has proved the food system inability to do what a food system should be doing: sustainably feed people. In a few weeks, millions of citizens have gone hungry all over the world. They are simply too poor to afford food and satisfy their basic human rights. At the same time, those who could were stockpiling and leaving empty shelves in the supermarket, while large-scale retailers were generating incredible revenues and food giants such as Nestle were distributing billions of dollars in dividends to their shareholders. However, COVID-19 has been much more than a matter of citizens' food insecurity. In the context of a food system that starves and starves, to quote the work of Raj Patel, millions of workers have been forced on the front line of the pandemic and kept selling their labor to farm owners, the companies of the logistics sector, supermarkets, and delivery platforms. They've been forced to risk their lives for a salary that is often lower than the minimum wage, and many of them have sadly passed away. From Italy to Canada, women and men have worked without adequate protection and distancing, faced the refusal of employers to deploy appropriate measures, and were denied legislative and economic support from the state and other public administrations. Workers were not only hit by the biological violence of the pandemic, but also by the socio-economic and physical violence of a political and economic structure that recognized them both as essential and disposable. Among the most affected there have been migrant farm workers. They experienced the intersectional injustice that derives from the combination between dire migratory policies, the power imbalance of the food system, the history of unequal development between countries, and the increase in nationalism and xenophobia that characterizes too many countries in the global north. However, it is important to stress that COVID-19 is not the root cause of these injustices. The pandemic has just brought to light the systemic conditions of marginalization, exploitation, and exclusion that millions of food workers and migrant workers in particular experience on a daily basis. At the same time, we hope that COVID-19 could also be a possible trigger towards more political awareness, more coordination, and more fruitful resistance. As I mentioned already, today we bring together farm workers, organizers, and activists who have been at the center of the struggle for farm workers and migrant farm workers' rights for years. We want to learn from them and create a space of long-term dialogue, collaboration, and transnational solidarity. We want to start from COVID-19 as a moment of intensification, but link the present with a past of systemic exploitation and use this combination to think about a future of emancipation, rights, and dignity. I'm extremely thrilled to be here with all of you today and really look forward to learning and being inspired by our very special and knowledgeable panelists. I now leave the floor to one of our co-hosts, Dr. Manoj Diasabe from the University of Bristol Law School, who will be moderating the interventions. Manoj, thanks a lot for being with us today and for your help in setting up the webinar. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Tommaso. That was a really good introduction, I think, to the situation and the purposes behind this particular webinar. So thank you everyone for joining us and taking time out of your busy days to be here. And I know some of you are suffering from webinar fatigue, so we're grateful to you. So as Tommaso mentioned, my name is Manoj Diasabe. I'm a labor law academic at the University of Bristol. Some of my previous research has been on farm worker labor organizations. So this is a really exciting panel for me to be participating in. So my job today is a fairly simple one, and that's merely to facilitate the conversations between the farm worker advocates. So you will not really hear a great deal from me. We want to use this webinar as an opportunity to give voice to the experiences of farm workers and organizers in the area. We're extremely lucky to have 5 representatives from 5 different organizations representing a variety of national contexts, and one with a more of a global perspective. And we think this will really add to the richness of the discussion and also give a sort of a global flavor to our conversation. It's a very challenging time for farm workers and their advocates, with COVID ravaging farm worker populations in places such as Ontario in Canada and Florida in the United States, 2 places from where our advocates come. So we're grateful for our speakers for taking time from the incredibly important work to join us. So just to give you a quick sort of rundown on how this substantive part of today's webinar will run, I will post 2 questions to the panelists and give them each roughly about 5 minutes to respond. The panelists will draw on their personal experiences to talk about, to try and address the questions, but they may also reflect on each other's contributions. And we'll have 2 questions, so we'll have 2 rounds of contributions. And then afterwards, we'll have a Q&A session. And as Tommaso mentioned, if you have any questions, please enter them into either the Zoom chat or if you're following along on YouTube, onto the YouTube chat. Someone will be monitoring it and collecting the questions. And we do encourage people to submit questions as they're going along, so we just don't have a big flurry of questions right at the end. So without too much more from me, I will state the first question, and then I'll hand over to our first speaker, and I'll give a brief introduction of our speaker as I call upon them. So the first question really is, what has the impact of COVID-19 been on the ground in terms of farm workers' health and safety? And how has this affected your organizing efforts? Now, I might start with Algie Jin Keng, who is an organizer with ITENGA, Voice of the World, which is active in southern Italy. He's also a PhD candidate at the University of Palermo. So Algie, can I ask you to kick things off?
Thank you so much. I thank the organizers of this very important session, webinar, and of course my co-panelists and those following all of us here on the webinar. Thank you all for this interest and being here with us. Well, I'd like to introduce myself first as an activist and as a victim of what we are talking about here, of agricultural exploitation here in Italy. I said good afternoon to everyone from Italy, where I find myself. Well, before I introduce myself as a PhD candidate, I must emphasize that my research, my PhD thesis, which was written on migrants' exploitation, contemporary slavery, is influenced by my direct experience when I was in the asylum camps in 2014. So I became a victim. I became a slave of circumstances in 2014 when I was in the asylum camps in Comiso in this region of Sicily. So going ahead with this thing, the experience led me in the academics to go and make research on the exploitation of other fellow migrants and farm workers, generally in Italy, where I have started my research in Piemonte, in Torino, and then continued my research to Valencia, and then to Sicily, where I did my case study at Campobello di Mazara. And this all relates to our present topic today, which is how COVID-19 affects the present living and working situation of these migrants. So first, as a victim, I tell you, very little things have changed. What have changed is the exacerbation of the impacts of what migrant workers, farm workers have been experiencing more than 10 years ago. So what COVID-19 has done towards the living conditions of people is that it has locked them out. It has locked them out in the marginalized situation, living in ghettos, living in slums and in abandoned places that neither government nor other interested authorities could have reached them, but were never actually usually reaching them also in those abandoned zones where transportation, police inspection, and every other thing was not happening there. Most of these places, especially where I did my research in Campobello di Mazara, which we can easily find in Google Map, they live in ghettos where they had no potable water, no running water, no electricity, no toilets, and no cooking, no kitchen to cook. So obviously, from this perspective, we've seen that it has a lot of impacts on their conditions, and no government was going there to give them marks according to the regulations of the COVID-19. What also happens that they could not live outside these marginalized zones because we were all locked down. But these were people who were feeding us, while we were locked down, and they had no other opportunity to go and access health or to move around from one place to the other. This is one aspect first aspect of how COVID-19 affected the working and living condition of migrants. Secondly, we also know that in a marginalized situation like this, migrants have the organization between them as disjointed units. It was very difficult for migrant workers to come together and move forward, march forward, and fight for their rights. In our own condition, as a member of ITENGA, Voice of the World, affiliated to Transnational, we have done our part. We were sharing food that we got from the Comune di Palermo and also from Caritas. And then Dr. Tommaso Fernando was aware. We also launched a donation online, which we were raising money to support people who were living in this difficult condition. And they were coming to our places, and we were also taking this food to them. But it was nothing that could improve their situation. It was just like having something at that moment to keep body and soul together. So moving from the notion that health is not just the absence of physical illness, most of these people continue to suffer in the same condition. So COVID-19 met most of these conditions there. What it has done is increase the vulnerability, it has increased the marginality, it has increased the needy status of these people. Therefore, they could not access those places where they can get social security, where they could get health help, where they can get food to improve on. So these were issues that we have been working on as an organization until today.
Thank you so much for that, Alaji. That's really useful to get that sort of perspective from Southern Italy. Maybe the next speaker I will call on is Vasanthi Venkatesh. She's a member of the Canadian-based Justicia for Migrant Workers, which is a volunteer-run political collective comprised of migrant farm workers, labor organizers, and educators. She's also an academic at the University of Windsor. Vasanthi, can I ask you to unmute yourself and speak?
Got it. Thank you, Manoj, and thank you everyone for having me here and also for joining the webinar. And thank you so much, Alaji, for your insightful remarks on the situation in Italy and how things have just, the conditions have just increased, the underlying conditions have exacerbated the situation for migrant workers. So the organization that I'm with, Justicia for Migrant Workers, was formed in 2001 to work with migrant workers in the province of Ontario. We center the voices of workers and support racialized and excluded migrant workers in taking leadership in their struggles. Our analysis and organizing inform each other, and we use an integrated approach that resists all forms of injustice that the workers face: immigrant injustice, labor injustice, racial injustice, as well as the forces of global capitalism, imperialism, and colonialism that undergirds agriculture and migrant work. So since 1966, Canada has had one of the longest standing seasonal foreign worker programs in the world, which is the SOP program that works through bilateral agreements with the Caribbean countries and Mexico. The deportability of the workers as they cannot get permanent status, the exclusion of agriculture from essential labor regulations, the systemic racism that the workers work under, feed each other in the interests of agro-capital. The workers work in isolated farms, far from the media and urban population and any health or legal amenities. Workers depend on the employer for everything: housing, groceries, communication access, even access to medical care. They live in cramped bunkhouses, 10 in a room, 50 in a tiny house. Any complaints are swiftly met with employer reprisal, where they not only lose their job, they're repatriated or deported back to their home countries, and most of the time cannot come to Canada under the program again. The agricultural lobby is extraordinarily powerful, and so for the past 50 years, nothing much has changed. So when the pandemic hit in March, there was a swift closure of all but essential work in Canada. Workers who were already in Canada could not go back home. Towards the end of March, ceding to pressure from the agricultural lobby, who did not want to lose their harvest, the Canadian government deemed farm work to be essential work. Even though the borders were closed off, it was decided that migrant workers from the Caribbean and Mexico would be brought in to work in the farms. The new workers go through 14 days quarantine and then work alongside the workers who have already been there. None of the underlying conditions of exploitative work have been changed. And these conditions were ripe for the pandemic to spread unremittingly. And within a month, we began to hear about rising infections. So for almost 2 decades, Justicia has established a relationship of trust with the workers. So workers, despite the risk to their livelihood, began to send us videos of the conditions and told us how afraid they were and how angry they were. And now there are over 1,000 infected workers. 3 healthy workers have died in the farms. The workers have also been facing stigma and racist xenophobic attacks from the local community, as they seem to be responsible for the spread of the disease. For the workers, the sense of isolation and fear has been multiplied. And the workers are now in almost conditions of incarceration in the farms. When you began to show the videos to the media, it was met with shock from the public. For the first time, the general public is actually seeing the conditions in the farms, as we have managed to harness immense media interest and the interest of various government and other organizations. As a strategy, we continue to center the lack of permanent immigration status as being the foundation of the exploitation and focus on the systemic and regulatory discrimination that the workers have always faced and is just now exacerbated. So we have been doing car caravans, carrying food and PPEs to the workers to show the workers we are there, and also to listen to the workers to inform our organizing strategy. For example, workers in a large farm with some of the worst conditions did a work stoppage only to encounter swift employer reprisal. And so last week, we called for a complete shutdown of all farms until the underlying conditions are changed, with full pay to the workers, to the migrant workers in Canada, and also to the workers back home who are waiting to come to Canada. There was hardly any testing done until last week. And then finally, last week, the provincial government announced increased testing, but focusing only on the migrant workers, excluding employers, supervisors, and Canadians who come in contact with workers across the food chain. They also promptly declared that even if workers have been tested as COVID positive, they still have to work if they are asymptomatic. The farmers know that the numbers we're seeing is just a scratch on the surface, and the actual numbers of infected are far, far higher, and that they would lose their profit if the workers have to be quarantined. When one health unit put a limit on the number of workers who can live in a bunkhouse, the farmers promptly filed an appeal at the regulatory board and got the regulation squashed. When another health unit temporarily shut down a severely infected farm with around 200 migrant workers infected, the premier of the province condemned the shutdown, claiming that it is the migrant workers who are not getting tested, and then said, this was yesterday, I quote, "These poor farmers, They're not trying to take advantage of anyone. They're beside themselves. And I'm not about to throw a hardworking farmer underneath the bus for nothing that he's done wrong. This poor farmer that he's talking about, that the Premier is talking about, is the largest independent greenhouse produce grower in Canada, the largest producer of peppers in North America. It's a multinational with farms all over North America. It is the workers that have no wage or status security if they're tested positive, and they're actually discouraged from testing by the farmers. And so overall, we are seeing numbers increasing daily. Just yesterday, there were, just in the last 2 days, there were 200 more cases in the Ontario province, and we expect that the numbers to continue to go up drastically, or that they will shut down the testing so that we never find out what the true numbers actually are. So from the words of the Premier, you can see that the provincial government is essentially a mouthpiece of the oppressive and exploiting agricultural lobby. We expect the agriculture industry to come down hard to suppress worker organizing and in order to protect its ability to continue production no matter what the condition is. But with the support of the workers, we have been responding with radical resistance at every step. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Asanti. Okay. We've got next Gerardo Reyes Chavez. He's a staff member at the Florida-based coalition of Immokalee workers. He's been a farm worker since the age of 11 and an organizer with the CIW for a number of years as well. Gerardo.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. And as my co-panelists were mentioning, I think that COVID-19 is exacerbating many of the vulnerabilities that have always been part of the production of food. And that doesn't exclude the US. So here in our context, responding to the question of what the impact has been, well, we work for an industry that is based here in Florida, it's the east of the United States, but that produces food all over the East Coast in states like Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, New Jersey. It hires about 30,000 workers, that according to the numbers that the Florida Tomato Growers Exchange has shared with us. And you work in Florida for the 9 months, 8 to 9 months of the season. And the conditions that we have been fighting to improve are conditions of wage theft, situations of violence, sexual assault happening to 80% or more of the female workers in a context in which 90% are men. And now that's changing a little bit. As workers, we have seen how all of these things, along with wages that were stagnant for more than 30 years, are the perfect recipe for disaster when it comes to a pandemic. Along with this, there's been situations of modern day slavery, 9 cases that we have investigated, 8 prosecutions that have taken place, more than 1,200 workers that have been freed from these conditions, 15 bosses that have gone to prison for committing these crimes. And all of these just render for a community that is absolutely vulnerable in front of this. And that's without even getting into the lack of proper response on the part of the government, which I'll mention in a minute. So our community is made from workers from Mexico, Guatemala, and Haiti, and a few workers from some other Latin American countries. The reasons why we are vulnerable, well, we work for an industry that it's very, very big, as I was saying. And what that means in terms of living conditions is that because of the low wages, you would live overcrowded, in overcrowded spaces with other workers, 8, 10, 12 people sometimes in mobile homes. That is very difficult when people hear recommendations about, shelter in place. What happens if you get sick? Well, you'll get everybody else sick because there is no good response from the Department of Health or from the state government. that basically prompted us to organize and started a campaign to demand access to testing. That was the first step, and we started that conversation in the midst of March. On April, we went on with a petition asking the governor and asking allies across the country to join us. These allies have been part of what we call the campaign for fair food. We have to stop it. And we're right now focusing exclusively on COVID-19 efforts. Since the beginning of this campaign that we were asking testing, we were asking for a space that would be dedicated for people to be isolated when positive, and for treatment. We don't have a hospital here in our community. The closest hospital is 45 minutes to an hour away, depending on traffic. People don't have cars. All of this is just was just a catastrophe waiting to happen, and we were pushing for that. In about a month, the Department of Health here in the small clinic that we have in Immokalee conducted only 163 tests in an entire month in lieu of a crisis that was unfolding. Due to the push that we did, that brought, I think, 230, if I don't remember incorrectly, organizations to support this petition, and close to 40,000 people that signed onto this petition brought the first response that was significant. A couple of thousand test kits were dedicated to Immokalee during the beginning of May, but then it slowed down. We had to resort on reaching out to health organizations that are internationally known, like Doctors Without Borders, that was working here for about 2 months. And then right now we're working with Partners in Health and Global Response Management because we didn't have a proper response from the local authorities and from the health departments that should be doing their work. For us, it's unconscionable that as workers, being in the most vulnerable of situations, we have to actually push for those who are supposed to protect the general public from the spread of COVID-19 to do the job. So that's what we must do, and that's what we have been doing. So the short answer is we have to stop the fight for our rights directly being implemented in the fields. We have been for many years bringing corporations to work with us. I'll talk about that in the next question. But through that, we have been able to establish a partnership in which we are able to work in establishing provisions in open communication with the growers that are participating under what we call the Fair Food Program. And that has brought more results than working actually with the local departments of health and the State Department of Health and from the governor. It took about a month for the governor to spill the name of our town, Immokalee. And that was after all of these thousands and thousands of people getting involved, demanding that we should receive testing, that we should receive spaces for isolation. And also one of the bigger questions that remains still open is the lack of resources for the community. You know, if you are poor, receiving miserable wages, you are gonna be afraid of even knowing if you have COVID-19 because it's a scary proposition. So we're doing everything we can right now. We are pushing together with these organizations on the public arena to be able to protect the lives of our community. We know that we have been saving lives using everything we got, our community radio station, the creation of face masks that have been distributed in the thousands. People have been reaching out from outside of the state and here in the state to give masks that have been distributed on all participating farms with us, but still more needs to be done. So I'll stop there for now.
And that's made significant efforts to try and organize workers, agricultural workers. So Bridget, can I ask you please to unmute yourself? I think you're still muted, unfortunately.
Someone had to do it. Just to say how all the speakers who've spoken so far, I would agree with pretty much everything they're saying about the situation in the UK. And starting off with the point that, you know, whatever problems there were pre-COVID have been magnified by COVID in terms of structural inequities and so forth. Unite is the biggest union in the UK and Ireland, but it's also the only UK union with any membership and organised structures via branches in rural areas. And in terms of our farm worker membership, when we're talking about farm workers in the UK, there's really two groups. There'll be full-time permanent farm workers driving tractors or working with livestock, and they're more likely to be members of Unite. And in terms of their health and safety under COVID, it's been as good or bad as it usually is. We haven't had much reported. There's been a lot of lone working and all those issues, but really nothing major in terms of those farm workers. What the other farm workers, the other field workers, will be seasonal workers, migrant workers, are doing picking berries and other produce. There were legion health and safety problems already in that for that group, lack of training, the high speed they have to work at, the pressure from supermarkets indirectly via their growers and by labour providers to keep up speeds, the nature of the accommodation, the fact it's outdoors work, stress, and so on and so forth. But for Unite, we don't really know exactly what's going on in the field because we have so few members amongst migrant farm workers. We've done previous drives to try and organise them, but there's been little ongoing retention of that membership. And that's for a number of reasons in terms of the issues around organising those workers. It's remote areas, you've got acute hostility from horticulture and employers. You've also got a hostility within rural communities to trade unions in general and even to the Labour Party. And you've also got still what is described by a lot of our members in rural areas as a kind of feudal nature of UK land ownership, of farming, of employment relationships and social relationships. And in terms of a big general union like Unite, although we've organised very successfully and supported migrant domestic workers and migrant workers in hospitality, that's tended to be in urban areas and with hospitality, particularly London, where we have recruited seasonal workers in agriculture. If they've gone back to their home countries, then they've not kept up their membership for obvious reasons. But if they've stayed, they are really looking to move to other sectors where the pay is better, the conditions are better, and there's more security. So at the moment, we don't know what's going on for farm workers in the UK. We know acutely what is going on in the meat industry because we have many hundreds of members in the meat industry, and that has been a disaster in the UK. But we don't have that same overview of what's going on in the farm workers. And this is a cause of great concern because there's nothing to suggest that their situation is going to have been any different from what's happened with meat processing workers, which is also about high rates of positive testing, where there has been testing, and whole households of meat workers, because they've all living together, the whole household has had to self-isolate, and they'll, instead of getting their pay, they're just getting statutory sick pay, which is about £95 a week, which is getting on for a quarter of what, or even a fifth of what they might have been getting when they were earning. You've got this duality in rural communities where migrant workers are visible in one way, but at the same time invisible in terms of official figures, resources and enforcement agencies. Enforcement agencies really don't know how many workers there are, and therefore what the scale of the problems are. So to take just one of the main enforcement agencies is called the Gangmaster and Labour Abuse Authority. To be a labour provider, you need a licence to operate if you are operating in sectors which are processing, packaging of all fresh food, drinks and other produce, agriculture, horticulture and shellfish gathering. That's been the case since 2005. So in those sectors, you've needed a licence to be a labour provider. And yet agriculture and horticulture is still at extremely high risk of labour exploitation. That agency, the GLAA, has started off under the State Agriculture Department. It's moved now to the Home Office. It's become part of a kind of vector for a kind of anti-immigration government policy rather than looking at labour rights and labour exploitation. The GLA has focused kind of obsessively about nail bars and car washes. And we think that's because partly it's urban, it's visible, they're widely used by the general public, but critically, because there's no big household names sitting at the top of the supply chain. At the top of the supply chain for fresh produce are all the big name markets, Tesco's, Sainsbury's and so on. And behind them are all their shareholders who want those dividends. COVID generally, we don't have a great overview of what's happened in agriculture and horticulture in terms of the migrant workers there. It's a real a huge gap in our knowledge, but we would suspect that exactly the same levels of exploitation and patterns of exploitation have intensified in agriculture and horticulture as they have in the meat industry and other parts of the sectors where we have membership. Thanks.
Thank you, Bridget. So I think that this message or the story that we're getting is twofold. One, about COVID exacerbating existing inequalities and farm workers' marginalized status, and in the case of what Bridget was saying, and second, just the invisibility of farm workers. The governments who have been responding to the situation have not responded proactively to the farm worker situation, and it's really sort of farm worker advocacy and activism to get the sort of contribution question. I'm going to ask Carlos Morentes to speak. Carlos is a labor organizer and farm worker advocate. He coordinates the North American region of La Via Campesina, which is an international movement of peasants and rural workers. And Carlos, you might give a slightly more global perspective on things.
Thank you. I'd like to first spread my thanks to the organizers for the invitation to be part of this webinar. The Transnational Institute, the University of Bristol, the University of Antwerp, and the rest of the organizers of this conversation. And of course, it is an honor for me to be part of this panel and to be able to say something on behalf of the experience that we have and the struggle that we have been engaged for more than 30 years. Right now, I'm in El Paso, Texas. El Paso, Texas is right in the US-Mexico border. I'm in the American side, but a few kilometers south of this place is Mexico, Ciudad Juárez, Chihuahua. So we mainly deal with border community and a farm labor force that is really impacted by the anti-immigrant policies being, unleashed by the governments. Yesterday, I participated in a meeting of La Via Campesina, and I gave a presentation about how we interpret this terrible human crisis. So let me repeat what I said to my sisters and brothers yesterday morning. I'd like to start with two lapidary phrases made by two of your friends in March of this year. Pope Francis, we are all in this boat. Es la hope si sec. Yes, we are on the same raft. This assessment of how to understand the pandemic seems correct to most of us. This terrible human crisis is affecting everybody everywhere. But there's another appreciation that I want to share to frame my presentation on how we interpret this crisis of COVID-19. Our interpretation is that many of us are not even in the boat, but in the water, being swept away by the furious storm, and that as much as we scream and try to attract the attention of those who are in the boat, they ignore us because they are focused on their own survival. So let me give you a very quick overview of the human crisis that we are facing in the border of United States and Mexico, and particularly of agricultural workers, when in these times, when they need the most the support of the state, the institution, and the rest of society in general, they have been abandoned. We have a farm worker center, right in the border between the two international bridges that connect Ciudad Juarez with El Paso. And as soon as we started to realize the seriousness of the pandemic coming to affect everybody in early March, we decided to create what we call a health and emergency committee by the workers, because we knew that the workers will be the less protected by society, by the institutions, and by government. So by the time the government decided to implement the so-called lockdown, when they decided to stop certain sectors of the economy, when they instructed all of us to stay home and work at home, they did something very contradictory. They accepted agriculture from the closing of the economy. At that time, the argument that was agricultural production was essential for the economy, but also to deal with the crisis. And it's true, during a human crisis, it's very important to secure the availability of food to help people cope with the crisis. So food became an essential activity. Farm workers suddenly became the essential workers. But there was a very important failure, and that was to classify agricultural production as an essential activity and implementing the rules for the conducting of this essential activity. In other words, farm workers were told to continue working in the fields, but without any measure of protection in the fields. So what we have today is farm workers working in the fields, afraid of getting sick, of being contaminated or affected by COVID-19. But at the same time, the institutions have failed to provide the basic measures of protection in the fields. On May 29, a 76-year-old farm worker who had spent 12 days in hospitalization fighting the disease died. He was a member of our organization. The same day, we decided to push more for the testing, because most of the testing going on in United States these days are concentrated in the urban population, and especially in the big cities, New York, LA, Chicago. The rural areas have been left out of the measures to contain COVID-19. So we started to push for testing of farm workers in our area. in the border area. And to this day, we continue to push for the testing. The lack of testing in agriculture areas, in rural areas, among farm worker and migrant communities, indicate to us that farm workers, like other sectors of the population deeply affected by the crisis, like for example, women, especially single mothers, and the elderly, are on the top of the list of those groups of human beings that that the system is willing to sacrifice in this human crisis to save other sectors of the population. Most of the farm workers that we work with work in southern New Mexico. Texas is the neighbor of New Mexico, the state of New Mexico, where there's a very important agricultural production. So most of the 5,000 to 12,000 agricultural workers of this area go to work every night to the state of New Mexico. Most of the health problems and most of the indications of the extension of COVID-19 has to do with transportation. When the workers are put in overcrowded vehicles in order to be taken to the fields. And then in the fields, they are put in overcrowded situations. Farm workers working next to each other. And that's the model of agriculture production that have existed for years. Farmers in general, they don't like to have farm workers, working in different parts of the field. For them, it's very important to be able to oversee the group of workers, to be able to control the group of workers. So there's no measures of social distancing or precautions in the fields. Most of the problems that we have with people testing positive has to be done with the transportation to the fields and having the farm workers in the fields, without any lack of protection on the part of the farmers. CDC, at one point, the Center for Disease Control, established rules to be followed for agricultural production. One of these rules is that before farmers telling the workers to enter their field, they have to check the temperature and they have to do a physical evaluation of each worker. And then if a worker, for example, was 100.4 degrees of fever, he cannot be sent to work. In the fields of southern New Mexico, they're not even drinking water for the farm workers in the fields, much less, measures of protection that are very important in these times. The situation of agriculture is very bad, and they are the ones that we are sacrificing to maintain the survival of society during this crisis. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Carlos, and for that really, I think, poignant metaphor that describes the situation of farm workers in the kind of the COVID era. So with the next question that I'm going to pose, we're trying to get at sort of the broader picture a little bit more. So we'll keep the COVID situation in the background, but think a little bit more and ask the panelists to reflect on how migration law and sort of the agricultural industry structure and supply chains affect the work of your organization. So in this, you may, in your contributions, you may like to think a little bit about visa regimes, border enforcement, nature of the food supply chain, and even sort of the organizational structure of labor, the kind of the organizational labor structure that you adopt to organize farm workers. So maybe again, I'll start with Allergy, if that's okay.
Yes, can you hear me? Yes, on top of the hierarchy of the Italian legal system, we should mention law number 199, 1998, which is the Consolidated Immigration Act on the condition of the third country national. Sure, this is basically on top of the hierarchy of all the laws that have to do with the migrant and the agricultural sector. It is this consolidated act that has the different facets of how to govern the green zones. I mean, the agricultural areas in Italy. You have the provincial laws under this thing, which moderates and administer the agricultural zones or the regions of Italy. We should keep in mind that among all the products, fruits and vegetables that Italy produces, tomato is one of the most famous, infamous product, which is 14% of world product. Italy exports like 14% to 15% yearly, annually to all over the world. This law basically criminalizes the so-called irregular entry and stay of third country nationals. So basically, when I entered into Italy as an asylum seeker, this law discriminates you and put you in an asylum center, which is also through the single asylum policy of the European Union. And also, this is the first method of criminalizing, but as a result of criminalizing irregular entry into the EU, migrants, therefore, third country nationals have to be subjected to some regulation that is staying in the asylum camps. While staying in the asylum camps, doing nothing, because most of these asylum camps also lack the basic stuff that they should give to marginalized, needy, so-called irregular migrants while they stay in the asylum camps. So basically what happened eventually is that I was subjected to work in the agricultural sector because I lacked everything in the asylum camps. I didn't have the pocket money. I wanted to call my people at home in the Gambia. I wanted to develop myself to follow the instruction university stuffs. And then for this reason, I have to go and work in the agricultural sector. I say this as a personal story, but this is generally the condition of many migrants who do not decide to finish or work in the agricultural sector. So as a basic law, the law number 199, which was since 1998, started discriminating migrants and purposefully throw them into the marginalized sectors. This is one of the laws that also stop migrants from reporting their conditions, because first of all, you don't have the regular papers to be able to go to the inspectorate, the police, the government, and denounce your exploiter, the one who enslaves you. This is one area that we should look at, but also the integrated border management of the European Union, is another problem of the same issue. That if you enter into Italy, you don't have the right, you don't decide where to move on, because you first entered into Italy, you have to follow the double regulation. So people are congested in the asylum camps, and then they are subjected to everything that comes their way because of their vulnerability. Because I needed money, I needed to live, I needed to eat more than what I was offered in the asylum camps. I was also subjected to go and do any type of work. And as an example, I can tell you that I have not done any operation yet, but I have hernia, 2 hernias at my back for working for 12 hours, 8 hours every day, and being paid only 20 euros while I live in the so-called asylum camps, which is a paradox of the European system. Secondly, it is the same law that also talks about workers, quota system. Like last year, Italy allocated 18,000 workers to be brought into the tourism sector. What happened is that the paradox of this allocation is that already there are more than 70,000 so-called irregular migrants in Italy. Such a law could have been flicked back to regularize the status of already those people who are here. And the other paradox is that people who employ, like Italian farm owners, big companies who are subjected by this law to invite people, won't invite them because first they don't know the people that they are inviting. They won't employ them before they meet them. Two, the bureaucratic issues involved are too much, and the cost also. And having the Romanian part of the EU just recently make these employers, prospective employers, to shift their options. So these are some of the contradictions within the Italian agricultural atmosphere. We have many laws from 2011, 2012, 2016 to the famous caporalato and agromafia law, and how all these laws were constructed. In some way, they were organized to leave a lot of deficiencies, defects, inadequacies that always push the migrant as the most vulnerable and a slave of circumstances.
Thanks, Alaji. That was a very set of insightful comments about, I think, the use of law to construct vulnerability, in an export industry for very important export industry for Italy. I'll just remind everyone to, if they do have questions, to pop it into the Q&A. We will have some time at the end. And just a quick sort of reminder to our panelists as well to try and keep to the 4 or 5 minutes, just so we do have time for questions at the end. With that, Vasanthi, please.
Thanks, Manoj. So Canada's agricultural labor migration system has been functioning for over 50 years, as I said before. It's considered a model program, the epitome of the triple win, where workers, sending and receiving countries are all one big happy family. But it's essentially exploitative racial capitalism in action that has systematized migrant apartheid and indentured servitude. Many workers come through the SOP program, the seasonal program, where the workers work in Canada for 8 months a year, tied to one specific employer. We're talking around 25 to 35,000 a year in Southern Ontario alone. In a country which extols its open migration policies, these seasonal migrant farm workers are the one group which has no access to citizenship ever. So workers work for decades, for 8 months a year, away from their families, spending most of their adult lifetime in Canada. They work here, they come back for decades, but are permanently temporary, never worthy of citizenship. Their deportability ensures that the workers are always under the threat of reprisal and removal. They're economically necessary, but socially and politically undesirable. Employers also socially construct their workers in highly racialized terms. Most migrant workers are from Latin America and the Caribbean. The selection of workers' nationality is often based on racist stereotypes of their abilities and temperament. Jamaicans fight a lot, citizens of this country, they're more docile or they're lazy, and so on and so forth. Workers are also segregated as per their nationality to ensure their isolation and prevent organizing. And employers use these stereotypes to set standards of work in the workplace as well. So if the workers do not meet these standards or complain, they risk repercussions not only from their employers, but also from the sending states who have an interest in keeping their employment contracts with Canada. This program was specifically drafted for the agriculture sector. The sector is exempt from several basic employment, health, and labor regulatory systems in a system which is called of agricultural exceptionalism, what's called. The workers have no right to unionize in Ontario, no right to overtime pay, sick leave, and other employment standard protections and health and safety standards do not apply to agricultural workers. So the system secures a commodified, exploitable, racialized workforce for these wealthy farms. And the sector also uses several narratives, rather myths, to legitimize their need. Narratives of food security, narrative of the yeoman individual farmer doing a quintessential Canadian task to provide food for Canadians, as exemplified in the words of the premier that I quoted earlier. But farm families are in the top 10 percentile in terms of wealth and are at least 3 times wealthier in terms of net worth compared to the average Canadian family. The number of farms that are corporations are increasing by the year. What was once seasonal labor is now made year-round using greenhouses, which now litter the landscape in Southern Ontario. These greenhouses are essentially food production sweatshops. The migrant farm workers work in close quarters, often 80 hours a week without overtime pay, and are required to work with pesticides without proper training or safety equipment. The accommodation that's sometimes attached to the greenhouses allows seepage of chemicals and pesticides into their bunkhouses. In Ontario and Quebec, more than 65% of agricultural production is processed and sold as a value-added product. More than 40% of food produced is exported, and the migrant workers are often employed in the harvesting of cash crops like ginseng, cannabis, 80 to 90% of which is exported. One farm, which had one of the highest COVID outbreaks, exports more than 70% of its food products to the US. So when Canada or the US or the global north talks about food security and protection of farms, we must understand the racist, imperialist and capitalist implications of food security across the value chain. It is not food that's being secured as seen in the poor food conditions of racialized and indigenous populations within Canada, but agro-capital. The huge supply or surplus of labor in the global south that is being exploited as migrant labor is a result of these agro policies done in the name of food security. So the deportability of farm workers and extraction from the global south are essential aspects of its sustenance, and so is surveillance. The workers are constantly monitored at every instant in the bunkhouse, when they go grocery shopping and of course at the workplace. Employers call the CBSA, border security, when workers are not performing properly, or even when they initiate legal claims. When they fall sick, they're repatriated back home before they can get health care or workers' compensation benefits. So in conclusion, in all ways, Canada has a racial apartheid system for migrant workers founded on discipline and control of racialized bodies to ensure agro-capitalism, much against the myth that exists about the country, about what Canada is. Thank you.
Thanks, Adante. That really nicely linked together lots of different issues. Gerardo, can I ask you to go next?
Okay. I mean, for us, something that we have been working with is the resistance from the local government, as I was saying. And the way in which we have been responding is basically in two fronts. We have in one side what we have been doing for many, many years. Since the beginning, the coalition has been fighting to increase wages and working conditions to be improved in the agricultural industry. And we did that by way of the campaign for fair food, trying to bring corporations like Taco Bell, McDonald's, Burger King, even Walmart to participate in what we call the Fair Food Program, which we have landed in 2011 with clear protections for workers that are contained in this little booklet that has been distributed among workers every season since 2011. We have 14 corporations participating with us, and we have a boycott of Wendy's currently here in the US, and we're asking people to support that. Why is that important to be mentioned? Well, it's because of that power of the market that we have pushed to be responsible when they buy tomatoes that include provisions of zero tolerance for modern day slavery happening in the fields. Child labor also has been included, and sexual assault. That has helped us to protect workers, but especially in regards to COVID-19, we have protections and the right of workers to form committees on health and safety inside this farm. What that has translated to, it's two things. Inside the farms, we have the collaboration with the growers that are now partners with the coalition of Immokalee workers in the implementation of protocols that have been triggered from the beginning of this pandemic. For example, there's a grower that has dedicated staff to do the sanitizing of the transportation that I forgot to mention earlier, but that is also very important. Twice a day, bathrooms are also sanitized constantly. People have hand washing stations in their place of work that are going with the different crews. And they have also dedicated people to go to get groceries for free for workers so that they minimize exposure instead of having several workers going to do their grocery shopping and having to observe all of these measures of mitigation, social distancing and the wearing of masks. They send somebody that bring the food for all the crews. So that has helped a lot. And that is only possible because of these partnership that was established through the campaign for fair food. We push the brands to do the buying in a responsible way, and at the same time, we brought the entire industry that is represented on the Florida Tomato Growers Exchange to do their part in respecting workers. That comes with a premium that gets passed on to the workers. It's not a lot, but it represents extra money at the end of the week for workers harvesting tomatoes with these companies that are now producing in other states up north, as I was mentioning earlier. So that's our response inside the farms. And along with this, there are provisions and protocols that are being discussed as we speak due to this partnership. So we're using and leveraging the power of the market to be able to bring things that make sense in regards to COVID-19. In regards to the community, one of these companies, Lipman, has been working with us and provided 7 hand washing industrial stations that were placed in key points in our community. And those have been maintained by the Department of Health, the Fire Department, and the Emergency Management here in the county. Along with this, we continue in the other front to push for more testing, and it has recently been ramped up. But the partnerships that we also pursued to respond better to this crisis have encountered blockades on their path. I'll give an example. Partners in Health, international organization working with us in Immokalee, after the Doctors Without Borders had to leave after their time here, which was very, very helpful for us. They have offered the community tracing collaborative effort to the Department of Health twice, first in June 1st, and then 10 days later in June 11th. And what they have been find along with the proposal of the U.S. Public Health Accompaniment Unit that they created and that have been working in states like New Jersey, Ohio, Illinois, North Carolina. When they offer that, the Department of Health simply said, thank you, we don't need that. We're thankful to you, but we don't need that. When workers call because they are sick and they ask for the isolation spaces that supposedly were dedicated to the community here in Immokalee, because we have been pushing for a long time, the response is that they don't offer that to you as workers. You have to actually push them so that they can then take you to these places. And it is just a horrible way to respond to a crisis. At the end of the day, I think that it all has to do with the fundamental value that workers have as human beings in the eyes of people that don't really want to do their part. We are less valuable than people in rich cities like Naples, Fort Myers, and other areas here in Florida. And that has become evident. So I'm asking people, if you want to learn more, I know that we're short on time, please visit the website that we created, the page focusing on this campaign. You can go to our website and learn more about the work we do. But the site for COVID-19 on our end, it's Immokalee COVID-19.org, no hyphen, and that's IMMOKALEE COVID-19.org. I mean, we have to fight for the things that we need, and we cannot do this alone. As farm workers across the globe, we are the pillars that sustain every single recommendation and shelter-in-place orders and all of those things. To make sense, we need to be able to work together to protect the communities that are more vulnerable. We have been able to gain some traction here, but it is still not enough. And that's why we are, as a country, the epicenter. As a state, we have become the epicenter also here in Florida. And Immokalee, I think, as of this moment, is the second largest place of infected people by zip code in this state. So we are almost the epicenter of the United States. So this needs to stop. Just check it out and try to connect with us if you think that that would be a way to help. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Gerardo. Bridget, can I call on you?
Yeah, thank you. So we feel that the power dynamics in the food chain absolutely control the rights of farm workers, and we've got very strong evidence of this. So, for example, a key example is something called the Agricultural Wages Board for England and Wales. So that used to set statutory rates of pay and conditions for all agricultural and horticulture workers in England and Wales. A Conservative government wanted to abolish it in 2012, and they launched a kind of formal consultation on this with nearly 1,000 responses. And many of these came from the horticulture sector. And what the horticulture sector was saying was, we have to scrap this so that we can cut our labour costs. But simultaneously, they would also be disclosing that part of the reason why they were under financial pressure was because supermarkets were freezing the amount of pay, the amount that they would pay for their produce. So one finance manager from a grower, a horticultural enterprise in the northwest of England, where they had, they supplied produce only to one supermarket, so this was their only contract, said they haven't paid us any more for our produce for more than a decade. And this was repeated by many others. The horticulture lobby had become more powerful in the National Farmers Union, the main lobby group for farmers and growers in the UK generally. And they won the argument for the abolition of the Agricultural Wages Board in the end. So supermarkets not paying enough to the producers of produce led directly to less pay and less protection for farm workers, including seasonal workers, because there were a number of provisions in the Agricultural Wages Board legislation that said, for example, there was a statutory requirement for each worker to have a bed for their own use. So to legislation there to outlaw the practice of hot bedding. So supermarkets and their shareholders impact not just farm workers, but we've been hearing under COVID from all the food workers across all our the companies where we are organised and have membership, that there are a number of things that could have helped them help our members in terms of social distancing. So, for example, if you had slower production speeds and lower volumes, would have helped everyone across the sector to control COVID, but the companies, these employers were under pressure to keep the volumes up and keep supermarket shelves stocked. And the nature of those contracts they have with the supermarkets are very tight and highly controlled by the supermarkets. So we've got the situation where food production companies have been reporting that they're producing volumes higher than they normally do at Christmas. So normally you've got a situation where supermarkets are in intense competition with each other for market share, but during COVID, they've been cooperating with each other. So early on under COVID, the competition laws between supermarkets were relaxed. So supermarkets could share data on stock levels, they could pool staff, they could share depots and vans. So there's also evidence that they've put their prices up as well. So you've got this strange situation where it's supposed to be a highly competitive situation, but they've been selectively competitive with each other to gain an advantage over workers and also over consumers during COVID. But this is also mirrored by a kind of selective quality to migration law. Some of the factors behind Brexit and the referendum result are very complex, but an anti-immigration agenda being pursued by the government is a very powerful factor. A lot of farmers and growers voted for Brexit because it was being framed that they would get freedom from the European Union. Almost immediately afterwards, they were faced with a labour crisis because so many migrant workers were coming from the European Union. And at the same time, you had a government that has been pursuing an anti-immigration agenda. So they've recently introduced a points-based immigration scheme with a salary threshold of £25,600. I'm afraid I don't know what that is in dollars, I'm afraid, but it's pretty high. And a threshold also of A-level qualifications. So that's the qualifications you would get as an 18-year-old in school. With their immigration policies aimed at lower numbers of the low skills, when in actually what they mean by that is the low paid. So people are highly skilled, but described as low skilled, but actually high skills and low pay. Oh, thank you, Thomas. It was, what was that, about £25,600, about 32,000 euros, is that right? So, and actually those quotes unquote low skilled workers have been totally essential for the production of food at every point of the supply chain, including the production of and the harvesting of fresh produce. In the meantime, after Brexit, farmers and growers lobbied to be a special exception, which is often their mentality, that they're kind of unique in some way, and lobbied successfully to have a seasonal agriculture worker scheme. So there are 10,000 workers coming into the UK under that scheme, but the industry needs 70 to 80,000 each year. And this scheme is currently under a pilot level at the moment. You've got a massive shortfall there in the number of workers needed for this seasonal work. And the government and the industry have been invoking some mythical spirit of the World War II, playing on nationalist and patriotic lines to try and get UK nationals to do the work. But you're still getting huge gaps in a mismatch between the numbers of workers available and the number of workers that are needed. So you've got all the conditions there for huge levels of exploitation in a sector which is already extremely high risk. You've got major labour shortages. You've got produce, again, quotes unquote, rotting in the fields. The supermarkets at the top of the supply chain absolutely do not care. You've got farmers and growers who are desperate to keep the contracts with the supermarkets. You've got a lack of enforcement capacity in terms of labour rights, particularly after 10 years of austerity policies under the Conservative government. But it also, of course, it's linked to political will, as austerity was a political decision, not an economic one. So you've got a government that wants to be tough on immigration and wants light touch regulation and a kind of deregulatory approach to pretty much everything. But at the same time, are happy for that to coexist with creating conditions for further exploitation. And then you've got major enforcement bodies, such as the Game Master body I mentioned earlier, which is more about anti-immigration than upholding workers' rights. So you've got a whole host of red flags there about the potential and probable growth in exploitation going on now in the UK. We know the problems because we're seeing them in other sectors, but in agriculture, as I mentioned earlier, we don't have the detail because of our lack of membership in horticultural side, particularly fresh produce. But our union reps who are based in rural areas have been spotting multiple examples of labour rights abuses, and through a number of means, reporting to enforcement agencies, using the media, and also working with the Labour Party to try and raise these structural inequalities to try and tackle exploitation. It's really, really very welcome to hear.
I might ask you to wrap up if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Sorry, we're just running a little bit shorter time, and we do want to keep some time for questions. We had hoped to finish at about past, but I think we might run about 10-15 minutes over time. Beg everyone's indulgence. Just before we finish and I hand over to Brid, can I please ask Carlos if you've got just to make a contribution on this particular question? You're on mute.
I'm gonna refer to something that is very important to know when we try to understand what are the complications of organizing work under this pandemic crisis. In United States, farm workers don't have collective bargaining rights. With the exception of California and Hawaii, in the rest of the country, farm workers don't have a legal framework that will allow for them to create the collective power that they need to pressure the agriculture industry and make changes, improve salaries and working conditions. So that's something, that's the reality of organizing agriculture workers in the United States. So these days, organizing is becoming even more complicated due to the crisis, but we have to continue doing that. And the only difference is that these days, we understand that farm workers are afraid to go to work in the field, but they don't have another alternative. They have to do it because the few dollar that they earn in the fields is what keeps their families back home alive. The other thing that is very important is that in response to the pandemic crisis impact on work, as you know, the unemployment situation in the United States have increased tremendously. 30 million workers unemployed who might not be able to go back to their places of work. So the federal government decided to approve, to establish this program. They call it the economic stimulus program, in order to alleviate a little bit the economic hardships of the people most affected by the crisis. But they excluded the agricultural workers. Farm workers did not receive a single penny from the federal government in order to be able to survive and even to stay with their families. They had to work because they were excluded from the economic relief established by the federal government. As a response of that, is a very, very serious exclusion with other organizations, we created in a border community, we created something that we call the Economic Emergency Fund, Peoples to People. And basically it's a fund that asks for the contributions from the community in order to allow us to give cash assistance to the farm workers that are in the farm workers families, the migrant families that are more in economic desperation. Many of the farm workers families that we have been able to assist with this cash assistance have been able to pay the rents or stay a little bit more days in their homes to protect themselves. So in the absence of protection from institutions and from the public sector, we have established our own means to support the farm worker and the migrant families. In regards to the impact of immigration, United States is the clear example of the hypocrisy of the North, because at the same time that we have all these discourse against immigrants coming to our countries to take away our jobs, to use public services, we have a situation here in the border of a extreme militarization of the border. And it happened before the crisis. So before the crisis, the Trump administration decided to contain the influx of refugees from Central America and the Caribbean. So they established a total rigid control of the border. But in the case of agricultural workers, there's certain flexibility. So we stop people from coming from the United States, but at the same time, the government is making sure that we don't stop the influence of the cheap labor that is the foundation of the North American agriculture. So In these regards, for us, something very important is the situation back home, the economic hardships peasants, Mexican peasants are facing. In the United States, we have from between 4.2 million to 3 million farm workers, and most of them are the peasants that have been displaced from the communities due to the United States policies like the free trade agreement, the new free trade agreement between Canada, United States and Mexico that came into effect 2 days ago. So we fight with all this. We continue to struggle and to organize. They're organizing work in very serious and difficult conditions, but this is the time when the farm workers need the most to be organized and find their own ways to stop or at least contain COVID-19 in the fields and in their communities.
Thanks, Carlos. Yeah, so that brings us to the end of the kind of the formal part of today's proceedings. I'm going to hand over to Brid Brennan shortly to coordinate the question and answer session. We've been collating your questions as you've been providing them through the 2 channels. Just to quickly introduce Brid. Brid coordinates the Corporate Power, Immunity and People's Sovereignty Project at the Transnational Institute, which is one of the co-sponsors of today's event. And she's been collaborating in a global campaign to put in place a binding treaty on transnational corporations and human rights. So in this context, she also engages in the struggles of the affected communities by TNC conduct, including, of course, migrant and refugee people. So Bri, I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, thank you, Manoj, and thank you to the panelists, and good afternoon to our attendees and to people who are plugged in from different parts of the world. I think we've had an amazing presentations from the panelists, both in terms of being sharp on what COVID-19 has really meant, but also what it has not meant. In actual fact, that farm workers have found themselves right at the center of what's an incredibly asymmetrical paradigm of work, labor, health conditions, and that this is systemic throughout the different parts of the world. So whether we were talking about Immokalee or Campobello in Italy, or Ontario, or Florida, or the US-Mexico border, I think this has emerged quite strongly from the contributions of the panelists. I think the other thing that I would sort of like to indicate is that we see that the sector of farm workers have actually paid also a very high price. We saw that in terms of being excluded from basic protections, but which is not just for COVID-19. I mean, this is a systemic part of the struggles, I think, that farm workers are taking on, but also that we see everywhere. And in particular, maybe it came across, especially in our Gambian colleague from the south of Italy. I mean, he gave very graphically the cost that's paid in daily health and daily conditions of the body in terms of working in these conditions. But also, we had very many indications of the impacts of COVID, the lack of testing, the lack of protection in the various, whether that was in refugee camps or in the camps and bunkhouses where farm workers are expected to live in inhuman conditions. But I would like to then maybe just have 1 or 2 words also on maybe what emerged in the last part of the discussion, which is the fight back. And that was also actually one of the questions. And I would mention here, we had an amazing example recently of, well, one of the kind of maybe challenging pictures actually is that despite the conditions that have intensified in the COVID-19 era, there is also great militancy from farm workers. And we had the case recently of Abubakar from the USB trade union of undocumented workers who went on hunger and thirst strike in Italy and forced the prime minister to actually receive the delegation. Of course, we all know that this can be very symbolic from governments, and those of you who talked about the law made that very clear that farm workers can't expect much from the law on labor, but also the law on immigration. But this kind of militancy is very important. And the other is, and despite what Carlos mentioned about the challenges and how difficult it is for workers, farm workers to develop collective response, we've had very good examples also in Europe on this. For example, the Leave No One Behind campaign in Andalusia, where not agriculture workers, care workers, domestic workers, construction workers came together and women workers also, because Andalusia, as people might know, is a huge concentration of Moroccan women workers in the strawberry fields. And so despite these conditions, they have been able to come together to fight back. So I would just have a review, because we're running very short of time. In reviewing the questions, because we won't be able to field them all, sort of basically there were maybe 3 clusters of questions that emerged, and some of them I think have been handled in the sort of evolution of the webinar. No, one cluster of questions was really about the conditions actually of workers, and whether the government sort of gestures could make a difference. For example, there was a question from Uruguay which said indeed the labor board there made some delivery of protection. Would this make a difference generally? But I think the picture we got generally was that workers were excluded, farm workers especially were excluded in many contexts, not only from health checks and so on, but from basic human and labor laws. And the other cluster, had to do really with the question of asking how can support organizations actually really support the struggles of farm workers? And maybe we can come back to that in our last moments. And maybe the third area, and that's what I would like to come back to, and maybe we can pose it to everyone, is the question, the fight back. What do you consider now to be the best, what do you consider to be the needed and effective strategies for the next phase of the struggle in your area? And perhaps what we can do is ask each of you maybe in 2 minutes, maybe to say what you consider that to be. And as Tommaso said at the beginning, we are really hoping this is the beginning of a new conversation also, as Carlos mentioned, but also it's the beginning of trying to see where we can also develop new elements of a transnational solidarity that is class-based, anti-racist, feminist, and indeed anti-capitalist in this moment. So I come back to you and ask you that question of what you consider to be the key elements of a strategy for the next phase of struggle. And you can also give maybe your last message in that as well. Thank you very much. Maybe we can start. We can take the same. Well, no, maybe let's reverse the order, because so maybe we start with Carlos in this context.
Thank you, Britt. As I mentioned, because the farm workers don't have the right to organize, there's no legal framework that allows the farm workers to build the collective power that they need in order to change the reality of oppression that they face. We have to appeal to society in general, especially the consumers, to be in solidarity with agriculture workers. Every time we eat, that mere action of having food 3 times a day or whatever, that mere action has an impact upon the lives of agriculture workers. So for many years now, we have been trying to convince, consumers to start embracing a very important concept for us, that you only consume oppression-free food. Food that is not the result of suffering of people, of social exclusion, and not only that, but food that is not affecting, not harming the environment. So I think that in a way where we are asking, society how to support, agricultural workers, improve their lives, and how to deal during this crisis of COVID-19 that is deeply affecting farm workers, men, women, and children who are right now in the fields, is by making sure that where they do, where the type of food they buy, the type of food we consume is not the result of oppression of people and damage to nature. So oppression-free food will be an indication, that we are moving into ending the global indifference of society when we speak about migrants and when we speak about agricultural workers.
Thank you, Carlos. So Bridget, can we call on you to share what the trade union is thinking about?
I think there would be 3 main points I'd make. The first being that what's been one of the things that's been noticeable about all the presentations here is, well, certainly I've felt that it's the same story wherever you are. So this is an issue about global labour and global migration patterns, and that's a starting point for that, because the similarities are not coincidental. It says something about the structural inequalities. The second, then, almost on the same theme, is this is also about global capital, and that we have to take the fight to them, and so that includes things about being disruptive, about attacking brand and different brands and their brand reputation and brand distortion, to actually point out the reality behind this, and picking up on Carlos's point about bringing consumers into this fight as well. And the third thing would be about a starting point about the financialization of the food system, that we have to look at who the shareholders are, we have to look at the role of private equity, we have to look at the role of hedge funds, and start taking the fight to them as well. That's more complicated, but is absolutely essential, because actually without them suffering and being disrupted, I don't know how much else can be done about the wider structural inequalities. Thanks.
Okay, and Gerardo?
Thank you very much. I would say there are 2 things. One, it's, and I was sharing the link for that, the boycott Wendy's. We're asking people to support us in that, because right now we have only 20% of the market participating with us, and we need more corporations to do the same. When that happens, workers then have the provisions that are included to respond in a more powerful way to crises like this, but also in the long term, to guarantee that more and more workers are protected, receiving the provisions and protections around violence in the fields, situations of modern day slavery, sexual harassment, and all of those things are being eliminated because of the creation of these type of power. The market consequences are key, because it doesn't matter if there were regulations. I mean, there are laws in the books that are, I agree with Carlos, they are insufficient and non-existent sometimes. But when we create our own power by bringing those buyers to be part of the solution, then we're giving workers the autonomy they need to be able to concretely tackle all the issues that impact their lives. That's one thing that you can do in the long term. That's gonna help us solve many of the limitations and vulnerabilities that we are currently dealing with. And the more buyers that come on board, the closer we get to shake the entire foundation of the retail food industry in this country, to be able to make that the norm instead of something that works for workers in the East Coast right now. And we're collaborating with other organizations on that. In regards to COVID-19 efforts, I'm asking everyone to go to our website, which is ciw-online.org. There you're gonna find a link that will direct you to the efforts of COVID-19, the campaign that we're organizing, and you can find ways to support. We're gonna be posting and updating constantly different things that people can do. Like the example I was sharing earlier, the campaign to push the governor to do what's necessary to protect our community. And in general, you know, learn more about what's going on for farm workers, and do not come as the creator of a solution. I think that these solutions need to come from the people that are suffering the consequences of the poor handling of things. And what we need is for people to give workers the respect that they deserve in all of this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gerardo. Yeah, we are running against the clock, but we still have Lashanati. Maybe you can speak now, and then we will come to Alajati.
Yeah, so just want to echo what Carlos said, which is a big issue for our organization as well, this agricultural exceptionalism. And it's often, quite often lost in the language of food security and food issues. So that is an important challenge for us in redefining narratives. The second thing that we should stress on is for the workers here in Canada, at least, challenging borders and citizenship and sovereignty is a very important cause. So for us, status now, our access to permanent residence for the workers is something that undergirds what we do, and will as well, because the workers realize that it's only them who's not getting access to permanent residence at any point, even as others get. So, and as well as working across borders in the Caribbean and Mexico with these workers as well is something that, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And yeah, finally, we will ask Alaji to please give us the last thoughts that he would like to emphasize in terms of strategy in fighting back. Are you there? Or muted maybe? Yeah, sorry. Yeah, have we lost somebody?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Oh, great.
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
I mean, I agree with the prior speakers on this to fight back. Sure, I speak specifically of the Italian situation here. Now we have a so-called regularization of farm workers that is brought by the amnesty of COVID-19. Regarding this, I think we can use it as an opportunity to balance the caporalato, the so-called illegal, also the agro-mafia, to have a network of by the regional laws, and this covers in every region monitor regularization and provide contracts, because the most important issue that this exploitation is driving on, surviving on the blood, sweat, and tears of the most vulnerable people is the lack of formal contract. To establish formal contract, we would not, and this is where I find myself a little bit aside from other debates in the Italian context, because I don't think that we should fight to push migrants into the agricultural sector where their lives are not guaranteed, into the ghettos, by saying we can provide them transportation, we can provide them, water, electricity, and other places in the agricultural sector, in the ghettos, abandoned places. I don't think that this is a sustainable project. I don't think that this is. I think it's a false agenda, because we are not moving on the integration, the economic, the formal integration of people into formal jobs. The migrants and many people who are working in the agricultural sector today would like to work there, but not under those conditions, and with only with formal contracts. But this is a project that would cost 950,000 euros to be able to form an anti-caporalato network all of the caporalato and gamma string, for example.
Okay, thank you, Alaji. I think you've sort of also, as the last speaker, in a way you have opened up quite some important horizons in the issues that need to be developed and thrashed out also with farm workers in relation to the conditions of that whole sector going forward. So it's my pleasure in a way to thank each of you and to acknowledge also that we, in the case, for example, of Abubakar that I mentioned earlier, and the militant strike launched by that section of the working force, the migrant working force in Italy, because I think it was Bridget who said maybe it's not yet so clear how the bigger issues around the question of the economy, the agricultural sector, the corporate dominance of the agricultural sector will be handled. But I think in terms of the struggle of migrant farm workers, Abubakar made these connections in the demands to the Italian government, particularly in relation to Italy and the agreement with Libya, which is causing, as we know, thousands of deaths in the Mediterranean, and also conditions of slavery when they are pushed back to Libya. But the conditions of slavery are not only as we see in Libya. So I will just go back to thank the main co-organizers today, who have been Tommaso and Manoj from the University of Bristol and the University of Antwerp. And I will ask Tommaso to make the last comments. Thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brit. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Alaji, Vasanti, Gerardo, Bridget, Carlos. It's been a great pleasure. The reality on the ground is harsh, and hearing from your experiences, it made it even direr and harder to imagine the condition in which the people who have been feeding us for so many months have been living and keep living at the moment. At the same time, I felt extremely energized and powerful seeing so many people joining in, but also all the calls that you made for solidarity, cooperation, and all the concrete examples that you made and put forward about what can be done, what projects you already have, and what we could be bringing together. And I think that, as Brit said, and as Manoj mentioned, today was just a first moment. And I really would like to start from those examples, from those projects, for those suggestions, including the one that Alaji just made, of moving beyond this idea that it's enough to treat migrant workers with potable water or decent conditions. We really have to think about a process of integration, recognition that goes beyond the fact that farm workers are factors of production. So it's been a great pleasure. I really look forward to continuing this conversation. The webinar has been recorded, and then the link will be shared by the TNI that has been providing an amazing support to the logistic and to the organization and to the communication. So hopefully there will be the possibility also to reach out to those people who couldn't make it today. Also, thank you very much to Monica and David for the amazing interpretation. As always, you do a fantastic work, especially when people like me are not used to speak slowly. So thanks a lot for all of that. And thanks a lot to the more than 100 people who tuned in. But really, a final word to the people, the activists, the organizers, those who took time to be with us, in a condition, in a moment of life that is even harder than it normally is. I really appreciate it. We all really appreciate it. And I think that we all learned a lot from your experiences, and really it's from your own words, from your own experience, and from your knowledge that we should move forward. And I'm sure that it's going to be a great journey together. So thanks a lot, and look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.